So we're going to be discussing the stages of fever as well as a few of the patterns, the temperature curves that are very common for fevers, and I've got a mnemonic for them as well. It's kind of funny, so bear with me. So phases of fever and physiological changes. Now this is a very simple graph, and it just kind of demonstrates how there's initially the baseline temperature is your 37 degrees. You initially start to experience the prodromal phase or the prodromal symptoms, and initially it stays at the baseline. You stay at 37 degrees, and in this phase you're just having a mild headache with lethargy and reduced appetite as well as muscle aches, so some kind of non-specific symptoms. Then as the temperature starts to rise, that's actually the onset of the fever. In this onset phase, the patient will feel shivering, feeling cold, as well as start to look more and more pale. Then the fever will settle down a bit and it will go to a stationary phase, but here the patient is now at this stable constant temperature where they're still feeling hot and they still have flushed skin. Now the most important part is when the temperature starts to go down again. By the way, fever is advised, unless it gets to too hot of a temperature, it's advised to let the patient just bear with it and just go through with it instead of trying to give antipyretic medication and kind of impairing the immune response in that way. So as long as the temperature doesn't get too high or the fever doesn't last for too long, so think about this as the y-axis and the x-axis. The y-axis representing the severity of the fever, the temperature, and the x-axis representing the duration of the fever. As long as the duration doesn't last too long, too many days, and as long as the temperature doesn't go too high, then they can bear with it. And remember not to give antibiotic medication, not to give aspirin, for example, to a child in case of Ray's syndrome. Now I deviated. We were talking about when the temperature starts to go back down again, and there's the resolution phase. Now the most important characteristic for the resolution phase, as a doctor, that you should know as well, is this: when the sweating begins in the patient. When the patient starts to experience sweating, that's your indication that the resolution phase of the fever has begun. Okay, now I'm going to be talking about these different types of fevers. There's a continuous, the remitting, and the intermittent, the undulating, and the relapsing. So let's start with the continuous. What does that look like? And our mnemonic today is going to be CURRI, curry, and that's for the continuous fever, the undulating fever, the remitting and relapsing fever, as well as the intermittent fever. Now the continuous fever, let's start with that. It kind of looks like a flat curve, flat line, and that's because the continuous fever, what's important is it does not touch the baseline, and it does not fluctuate either. It does not fluctuate more than 1 degree Celsius. It does not fluctuate more than 1 degree Celsius, and it does not touch the baseline. So that's important in continuous fever. Now in remitting fever, this one, again, it's kind of similar to continuous in the fact that it does not touch the baseline, but here the fluctuations do exceed more than 1 degree Celsius on a daily basis. Okay, so it's going to exceed more than 1 daily, go up and down, fluctuate more than 1 degree Celsius every day. That's why it's remittent. It's going re-up and then re-down. It's remittent. Talking about intermittent, now intermittent, yeah, it's going to have fluctuations once again, and the fluctuations may exceed more than 1 degree Celsius again, but the most important thing about intermittent is that it does touch the baseline. It goes, the temperature does go back to normal and then back up again, and back to normal and then back up again. So continuous, the temperature did not touch the baseline, meaning it did not go back to 37 degrees, which was here. And it didn't fluctuate either. It was kind of the boring plain one. Remittent did not touch the baseline. However, it did exceed more than 1 degree Celsius. Intermittent does both. It touches the baseline and it does exceed 1 degree Celsius fluctuation. So while continuous and remittent didn't touch the baseline, intermittent did, and so does relapsing. relapsing. In fact, it touches the baseline for even longer than intermittent does. So remember, continuous and remittent didn't even touch the baseline. These are high fevers. Intermittent did, and it did fluctuate. Relapsing is a type of fever in which the temperature falls back to normal, and it in fact stays normal for more than one day. So relapsing fever is defined by the fact that not only does it touch the baseline, but the temperature in fact does go back to normal for more than a day, and that characterizes relapsing fever. Now I'll go on to talk about Actually, before I go and talk about the undulating fever, which is the last one, I would like to touch on some specifics. This relapsing fever, in which it goes back to normal, in which the patient's temperature goes back to normal for more than one day at a time, one of these classes is tertiary fever. And this is common in malaria, and it's a fever in which the patient experiences high temperatures on the first and third day, but it's completely normal in between. So it's kind of like first day, normal, third day, up, first day, and then it's kind of repeats again. So in this tertian fever in malaria, the second day they have no fever. There's also a tertiary fever. There's also quaternary fever. There's also Palebstein fever, and there's also a typhoid fever in which it goes stepwise fever. Stepwise fever is typhoid fever. Okay. Now, undulating fever. This is when there's a slow increase and a slow decrease, and this occurs in brucellosis. I remember this by the fact that brucellosis is transmitted by dairy. Okay, it's transmitted by dairy, not dairy, but like farm animals, and by dairy cows. So brucellosis is transmitted by farm animals, commonly the cow, which have udders. And that reminds me that brucellosis is an undulating fever. Bit silly, but it helps. So, hope this was useful.